Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. My name is Jessa Wyness. I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Specialist at PCADV.
And I'm Michelle Cooper. I am the Technical Assistance and Education Manager for PCADV.
Today, we're going to talk about trauma and self-care, specifically in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. So before we get started, it's important to understand kind of the topics that we're talking about can be very hard to hear, or can bring up some things for you that you maybe didn't expect, or maybe you are expecting. Because whenever we talk about trauma, this can sit with you in different ways or bring up different things. So please take care of your needs. Listen to what your body is telling you. If you need to step away or, close your eyes, take deep breaths, whatever it is that you need to take care of yourself, please do. And we're going to go ahead and jump right in and talk about trauma. So this is a nice visual representation of the ways that trauma can show up that we may not traditionally think of as trauma. So things like childhood abuse or neglect, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse may be more familiar to us in our work, but also things like medical intervention, specifically in LGBTQ plus community, witnessing acts of violence, cultural, intergenerational, and historical trauma, which we'll talk about a little later. And then, of course, accidents, natural disasters, grief and loss. Those things are kind of things we're going through right now with COVID. We're in a national level pandemic, a global pandemic, as folks know, and we're grieving the loss of our previous lives, the way things were, and the sense of normalcy that we may have felt. And we're going to talk about how to address that, understand the impact of that, and how to take better care of ourselves while we're working through this. So before we can, build off of what trauma is, it's important to understand what we mean by trauma. So when we're talking about trauma, it's a unique individual experience that could be an emotionally and or distressing set of experiences, circumstances, or events that are often life-changing. And it overwhelms your capacity to cope. So what this means is that it's an experience that occurs outside of the realm of normal experience and has profound effects on the individual's development and well-being. Because everybody is unique and has their own set of different coping skills that become overwhelmed, they also have different support systems and other factors, that not everyone experiences trauma in the same way or the same trauma symptoms related to the same event that occurred. So it's really important to understand what we mean by trauma, again, in order to build from that.
Great. So as we're talking about trauma, I think probably many of you can really relate to this with regard to the work that you do and obviously the survivors that we work with. And there's certain things that we have come to understand may indicate trauma that aren't somebody standing in front of you telling you about the trauma that occurred. Trauma has a lot of physical symptoms that can manifest in lots of different ways. And so in a shelter setting, for example, this could be a survivor that experiences aches and pains, that asks for aspirin or Tylenol or things often because they just have a lot of discomfort that's, not seeming to go anywhere and not seeming to be able to be dealt with. It may impact sleep. They may have issues with sleeping too much or not being able to. So all of these things are things that we're sort of trained to look out for, with regard to the survivors that we work with. But very often, these aren't things that we take the time to check in about with regard to ourselves. And what we know and what we're here to talk about today is how trauma can also impact us. And we're going to talk a little bit about secondary trauma in a moment. But in the meantime, it's really important for all of us to think about how trauma can manifest for us. And this may be very different now that we are in this space where we are adapting to a pandemic, whether it's that we're working from home more than often, whether it's we're having to go into work during a time that feels unsafe or that has a lot more precautions that we need to take. These trauma symptoms can manifest with the same kinds of things that we're used to seeing with survivors. We may be noticing aches and pains that we didn't notice before. We may be finding ourselves thinking about, man, I'm having trouble sleeping. I've never had trouble sleeping before. Or in the middle of the day, I just get so tired and I'm not really sure exactly, why this is happening. I've never felt like I needed to take a nap in the middle of the day before. There may be just some unusual manifestations in our bodies and in our minds that we haven't had to manage before. And so it's really important to frame these things with regard to trauma and to help use that as a way to remind ourselves that right now we're dealing with a traumatic situation, we're dealing with a traumatic experience, and we can use those trauma symptoms as cues about things that may be happening that indicate we may need to be, engaging in some self-care, which we're also going to talk about in a little bit. So one of the things to remember is that when you experience trauma, it's not just one thing that happens by itself. Because of the things that Jessa mentioned before with regard to trauma, they're unique to each person. What we experience are some manifestations of trauma that hit on three key areas. So the first thing that happens is that trauma really impacts our ability to filter what's coming in properly. So when we experience trauma and then our perception of the world becomes filtered through that trauma. And I'm sure that everybody can think about that with regard to COVID-19 and how this trauma is already impacting how we are viewing and experiencing the world around us. When a very traumatic thing happens, and it doesn't necessarily have to be trauma with a big T, but very traumatic can be, anything from misplacing car keys to having to work and exist during a global pandemic. There's an emotional and cognitive disconnect that can happen that will really prevent us from engaging completely in the world around us in the same ways that we did before the trauma occurred. And then the other thing that happens is that any unaddressed trauma or trauma that has happened to us before also sort of impacts our ability to perceive things in the way that we did before this traumatic experience happened. And a lot of times, a new traumatic experience or a new traumatic, engagement may bring up some of that unaddressed trauma in ways that we didn't experience. So all of these things sort of work together and really create a new way of looking at the world and a new way of experiencing the world, all through that lens of the traumatic experience.
So when we talk about trauma experiences, we're not only talking about our physical experience with it, right? Our body's responses, but it's also important to understand how trauma impacts and changes the brain. So whenever we think about our brain, we think about it in terms of front brain and back brain. Our front brain is typically in charge of our focus and attention, and our back brain is in charge of our emotions and reactions. So in an individual who has not experienced trauma, the individual gets the emotional stimuli, comes in, it's sent to the thalamus, kind of taken in, sitting of like, okay, here's what's going on. Let's process what's going on. So now I'm going to send it to the cerebral cortex. Then I'm going to send it, after I process what is actually happening, I will send my response down to the amygdala, and out will come my emotional response, right? So whenever I think about this type of response, these are things that we go through every single day. It's happening right now, right? Like sometimes you hear your email ding, right? You get the ding, emotional stimuli, right? I hear my sound or I see the notification. It goes up to get processed of like, what is happening, right? Is this a threat? What is this? And it's an understood thing of like, nope, that's just the sound of my email coming through. It could invoke some other emotions for you. I do not know. That is for you. But again, you process that. It will then come out as an emotional response of either an eye roll, maybe, or you clicking on it, or whatever that response is, right? It's calm, cool, and collected. Again, something that we go through every single day, multiple times a day. It's happening now as I'm talking. You're doing the same with what Michelle and I are saying. It's going in, processing, and coming out as emotional responses. Now, when we talk about somebody who has experienced trauma, the emotional stimuli occurs and goes into the thalamus of like, okay, right, I took this in, the brain has it. But instead of being able to process, it goes straight to the amygdala and releases an emotional response, right? So this could, again, show up in many different ways. One really important way to think about it is we think about this often with smells. So if you smell something that reminds you of a good memory, right? Because it can be a positive. I'm going to put it in the positive right now. It smells like, like a field that I used to play in when I was a kid with my best friend, when I was younger. So you smell this and it instantly takes you there, right? It instantly brings about an emotion. Your brain didn't necessarily process that. It's implanted in the way that it thinks about this stimulation, this stimuli. So this can happen again whenever folks see certain colors, when they hear certain voices or certain words, right? This is what is considered being activated, where individuals just take in something, have an experience, whether it be a sight, sound, smell, conversation, or just existing in a certain environment, and instead of the brain being able to process of like, hey, this isn't a threat, right? This isn't where we were when the traumatic event happened. My brain can't separate that. It's permanently now an emotional reaction whenever this item or this event occurs for me. So it's really important that we understand how it changes the brain, because this can also impact the decision making of individuals, right? Because I'm not able to fully process what it is that's going on, or I may not be able to remember full pieces of the event, of the traumatic event that occurred. And this is now my new memory. So this is what I have. So we may be seeing survivors that, again, from one minute to the next, the story may seem different, or what they're telling you about their experience is different. And it's important to understand that you're witnessing trauma responses because of the way their brain is now rewired, because this is now how they experience those things.
So an important thing to remember is that when you're dealing with trauma, it's layered. There's lots of things that happen in addition to a presenting trauma. It connects with the trauma history and it connects with co-occurring trauma. And so when we're talking about this big topic of trauma, as it relates to our work, as it relates to what we do every day, we need to remember that all of these things sort of fit together, layer after layer, to create an experience of trauma that's sort of always there, and that we need to be aware of so that we can figure out how to work with it and around it as needed. And right now, one of the things that's going on for all of us and all of you is that we're experiencing this very large traumatic experience that is probably activating for many of us in different ways, and is creating a situation where we have to readapt and readjust to a traumatic situation that's happening, taking into account our own trauma history and things that may be happening at the same time, in addition to the work that we do with people that experience trauma. Justin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think it's important that, we're talking a lot and saying the word trauma very often, right? And for a lot of folks, that means, again, different things. So even if you don't think you're experiencing trauma now. What we're going through is a collective traumatic experience, like Michelle said, on a global scale. We also can have, a trauma history or past trauma or a co-occurring trauma that's also happening in tandem with this global pandemic experience. And this could show up in different ways, things like routine disruption, right? Looking at news articles, constantly being exposed to these types of things all the time. It's also an election year, which can also bring up a lot of things for a lot of folks and add to this traumatic experience. But it's also important to recognize secondary trauma. That's also a co-occurring trauma that we're experiencing. As advocates, this is embedded in our work. Or what we mean by secondary trauma is emotional residue that results from hearing about or witnessing other folks' traumatic experiences, right? Domestic violence is one of those things. So as advocates, that's something that's ingrained in our work. But now we're also supporting our friends, our coworkers, our survivors, right? Our friends, our family, everyone that we're in contact with, including ourselves, through the global pandemic. Right. So now we're also exposed to the secondary trauma of the global pandemic as well. So we're being exposed. And again, it's important to understand the context of trauma in the global pandemic, but also in the context of our work, right? And how, just like in this image, it's like an onion, it's different layers of trauma that we're navigating literally daily.
So it's really, really crucial to remember that who you are matters. And what that means is, just like we've been talking about throughout this presentation, trauma is an individual experience. So even though we're all experiencing this pandemic together, and we're all, reading similar news articles, watching things on TV, through the internet, our experience of this trauma is different. Every single one of us is experiencing this from our own perspective, with our own trauma history, with our own coping skills and, levels of resiliency. And so it's really, really important to take that into account anytime we talk about trauma. And we learn this in advocacy training, where we can never make assumptions about what somebody else has gone through based on our own experiences. And the same thing goes when we are thinking about how this applies to us as, supportive people that are dealing with other people's trauma all the time and are now placed in a traumatic situation with a global pandemic. Who you are matters, because when you think about trauma subjectively, how it impacts you and the things that you need to feel safe and secure, generally speaking, and when your trauma has been activated, that makes it a lot easier to come up with self-care plans that are going to work best for you. It's an individual thing. What works for you may not work for someone else. And so we can certainly share what works and what doesn't, and talk to each other about trauma and how we deal with it and how we cope and, what works well. But at the end of the day, our self-care strategy is going to be up to us to figure out, because we're the ones that know what feels good to us. And so it's just something that we want to frame going into the next section, because we want to talk with everybody about ways that you can take care of yourself during this time. We're all experiencing a lot right now. And so being able to figure out a way to check in, to create self-care plans that work and that we can use to lean on during traumatic times are a really good habit to get into.
So whenever we talk about self-care, typically in the work that we do, right, it's usually met with like a, oh no, not this again kind of conversation, that kind of feeling. But what we're talking about is a different level of self-care, or a different type of self-care than traditionally talked about. Because, nobody, again, when we're talking about trauma, you never see it coming, right? You don't plan to experience a traumatic event. Or else it wouldn't be that anymore, right? So the same can be said with the pandemic, right? Nobody saw this coming. So you may have a self-care plan that's already established, and it may not work now because the environment is different. The type of needs that you're emotionally having are different, or you may not have had one before, right? And now it's time to start one. So that's kind of where we want to have this conversation of, this is something that can be adaptable for any level of where you are. But it's important to understand why we need one, right? So whenever we talk about self-care, again, we talk about the impact of the experience of secondary trauma. In this field, it is inevitable to have this experience of secondary trauma just by nature of what we do. And it's similar to a lifeguard and a sunburn, right? It's bound to happen. It's in the nature of their work. There's really no way to avoid it, right? But there are precautions, there are steps you can take to be better prepared for it. So now you see the sunshine, right? So the lifeguard's sitting in the sun, advocates are sitting, in our field during a global pandemic with individuals, again, that are experiencing trauma, and along with our own experience. When we talk about self-care, what it does is it acts like a sunscreen. It lessens the impact of the sun, right? But sometimes, you walk out the door with it, or, oh, I'm not even going to be out that long. Or, I don't really need sunscreen. I'll be fine. I'll just wear a floppy hat, right? So, what then happens is aloe vera. So, ignoring self care, right? Or enacting minimal self care acts like aloe vera. It happens to help soothe after the sunburn, which is fine, but it's not a long term solution, right? So we can't keep waiting until the burn occurs, until we're getting closer and closer and absorbing more and more trauma experiences, and then just trying to like put a band-aid over it afterwards, right? Of hearing weeks of experiences and then like, oh, I'm going to treat myself to a coffee and everything's fine, right? That is not a long-term solution. So when we're talking about the importance of developing a self-care plan, it's important to anticipate. It's going to happen, right? Again, we work in a field that's steeped in trauma. Again, we're also navigating a global pandemic on top of that, with tactics of abuse being finagled to fit into that as well, right? So we're seeing that occur. It's also important, again, to be self-aware. Who you are matters. Know what your triggers are, know what your activators are, understand your own personal experiences and what your personal needs are, your own love language, if you will. And then, of course, to have a self-care plan. And, when we're talking about self-care, we're not talking about just getting through the day kind of self-care. We're talking about those days where you like crawl from your bed to work, and you just don't have energy to even think, right? Where you're just that drawn down and exhausted. This isn't a knock, again, on bubble baths or pedicures or like shopping as those types of things, or like yoga, those types of things. But what this is a call to action for some more serious self-reflection and self-awareness to incorporate that into your self-care plan.
Great. So now we're going to talk about what self-care really looks like. And we're going to talk about this really within the framework of COVID-19. But please know that all of these things that we're going to talk about next are applicable no matter what. Having a good, solid self-care plan, and like Jessa said, more than just, the stuff that we kind of engage in as special things, whether it's, having an art day at work, or, taking a bubble bath or things like that. Solid self-care plans can be boring. They can be, not that exciting, but they're the things that we can do that can really make all of that difference. The sunscreen, as Jessa said. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to offer some suggestions on things that you can do to engage in meaningful self-care. And once again, specifically, for those of us right now who are dealing with, having to be domestic violence advocates, work in programs, do all of these things that we typically are supposed to do, but under these very, very different circumstances. And while there is a crisis situation happening around us. So we're going to be talking a little bit more specifically about that, and some ways that you can modify even existing self-care plans so that they fit a little bit more into some of the changes that we've had to make due to COVID-19.
Right. So as we talk about self-care, we're going to talk about it kind of into three categories, because again, this isn't just a one and done type of approach. It's important to tailor it to your needs depending on your environment. So there are basics at work and outside of work. So when we talk about self-care basics, these are exactly what they sound like. Things like making sure you're changing your clothes, or at least your shirt, every day. Making sure you're drinking fluids, whatever feels best. It doesn't have to be water. It could be whatever that is that's most comforting for you, to make sure that it's always near you, right? To make sure you're staying hydrated. To make sure that you're showering or bathing. Not necessarily every day, right? Again, this is whatever works best, but if it's been a couple days, it might be worthwhile, again, to plan this ahead of like, okay, so this week, maybe I may not be feeling great. I have a lot on my plate. I have a lot going on, but I know I at least am going to shower twice this week, right? To make small goals around showering and hygiene needs. This can also look like making sure you're taking your medications or your vitamins regularly. Same thing with napping or sleeping, to listen to your body that, if it comes to a certain time where you're just dragging and can't function and need to rest, that's what basic self-care is listening to your body and giving yourself the allotted time that you need in order for your body to get the rest it needs to continue functioning for you. It can also look like developing a routine, right? Again, this doesn't have to be something that goes above and beyond of like, for some folks, it may work to do it this way of like every half an hour planning your day out. Again, for some folks, it may be very loose of like looking ahead at the week of, here are the certain tasks that I know I have to do this week. Here's where I'm going to incorporate basic things like showering or what that could look like. So, and there are two really great resources that we're going to share. One of them is this Instagram account. It's called Make Daisy Chains. This individual does a lot of a series called Boring Self-Care, which is amazing. So if you're on Instagram, it's great. But things like, communicated how bad I feel, put sunscreen on, took my meds today, reached out to someone that I haven't talked to in a while, went to therapy. Again, this is a really good example, or survived a day at work, right? Sometimes that's like one of those things that like, yep, I'm going to post this on my story because this is exactly what I feel today. So there are just some reaffirming ways for you to understand or get a better understanding of what basic self-care looks like and how important it is, because it keeps you functioning in your day-to-day. Another really great resource is this interactive quiz. This is something that I take multiple times a week. There are some days where I take it multiple times in a day because it's a really gentle way to touch base with yourself. And again, you can have this in the background on the side of your work. It doesn't require a sit down and answer a million questions. So for this one, have you eaten, right? I haven't eaten, and I haven't eaten at all today, right? So I don't need a snack, I need to eat, right? And it just encourages you of like, whatever it is that you need right now, do it. And if you are done, it takes you to the next thing. Are there any meds you need to take? Nope. And then it continues, again, checking in on your basic needs, things like hydration and food and rest. Again, basic hygiene needs. It's very easy. It's a great thing you can work on. Again, if you just need to check in with yourself and maybe aren't sure how or not sure why you're feeling how you are, it's a really great resource to do that.
The next kind of self-care sort of bucket is the at work. And, usually when we do this kind of training, we talk about at work self-care and outside of work self-care. But for some of us, right now, at work and outside of work don't really have a whole lot of difference. So one of the side effects of the global pandemic has been many of us have had to stay at home more than we typically would. So I think it's really important to honor that first and foremost for those of us who, maybe aren't able to even have as much of a boundary around, what is work and what's outside of work. A really important self-care thing to do is to find ways to create that boundary. But many of us, still have to be going to work during a global pandemic, which means that self-care at work looks a lot different than it did before all of the COVID-19 restrictions and CDC guidelines came into play. To be blunt, being at work can feel like trauma right now in a way that it didn't before. And so it's really important to think about, no matter what work looks like for you right now, to think about ways that you can engage in self-care so that work feels as safe as possible. Some examples of this might be if you are having to go into the office or if you are working in a shelter right now, thinking about some of the things that may be elevating your anxiety or maybe making you feel uncomfortable. We can't take away all of those things, right? We have to go to work. We have to, do the things that we need to do to get through our day. But engaging in self-care at work right now might look like getting a kind of hand sanitizer that we really like a lot. It sounds silly, but if it's the difference between, having the kind that we don't like and having the that we do, that's a little form of self-care that can be really important. Now, I understand that sometimes finding the kind of hand sanitizer that we like best can be a little impossible. So I'm using that as an example, but if that's not available to you, there's other ways that we can think about incorporating self-care with regard to literally health and sanitation at work that can make us feel safe and secure. Something like spraying down our desk or workspace, making that part of our routine, making that something that we can look forward to instead of something that we're dreading or not excited about. Also, with regards to those of us who are working from home, thinking about how we can create good boundaries so that our workspace is as separate from where we take our breaks and when we are not at work. And I realize that once again, this can seem kind of impossible, but even if it's something as simple as during the workday, taking the time to get up, walk away from wherever it is that you're doing your work, whether it's in a dedicated office space or sitting on the couch with your family members all around you. Having an opportunity throughout the day to walk away from where work happens and engage in time someplace where it doesn't. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with feng shui. If not, I apologize. But one of the aspects of feng shui, which is just a form of making your space sort of energized and really, as functional as possible. One of the suggestions that's made is to, not take work into the bedroom, right? That the bedroom is supposed to be a space that's just for sleeping, that's just for relaxing. And so making that space just for that, a dedicated space for sleep and rest. And I like to think about that with regard to self-care at work, if you're working at home, is making sure that you have a dedicated workspace and that workspace is just for that, so that you can draw a boundary between, where work happens and where it doesn't. Other things to think about with regard to self-care at work are exactly what I just talked about, things like taking breaks. During a crisis situation, it can feel really bad to take breaks. Whether we're working in an office, whether we're working from home, there's this idea that because a crisis is happening, we need to always be on. We need to make sure that we're always checking our email. We need to make sure that we're ready to respond to absolutely anything that comes up at any time. And it's really important to start thinking about how you can engage in self-care so that your schedule doesn't become overwhelming, that we're taking time for breaks, that we're taking time to check in with ourselves, and that we're prioritizing what we need to do so that, if direct service is something that you're responsible for example, you have time built in where that, you don't have to be responsible for that you have, whether it's when your shift is over, whether it's, when you're taking your 15-minute breaks or whatever allotment of break that you have throughout the day that works for you, that when that time happens, that you honor that time and you're not, still checking email, taking phone calls, things like that. This can be really hard to do, but setting that boundary is really important because you have to be able to, I like to think of it as a marathon, not a sprint, right? You have to be able to go for the long haul. And in order to do that, that means pacing yourself. And pacing yourself means honoring your break time. That also means making sure that you're engaging in self-care outside of work. So we have basic self-care down, right? You are making sure that you're having some kind of a routine, that you're keeping yourself fed, that you're making sure that you're drinking water, that you're taking medication, all of those things that you need to do to survive. You're taking care of self-care at work. You're making sure that you're setting boundaries. You're making sure that you're doing things that help you be the best that you can possibly be while you're at work. There's also outside of work self-care, and that means engaging in things that allow you to disconnect from work, which once again right now can be challenging because there's not a lot of things that we can do outside. There's still a lot of restrictions around with regard to COVID-19. That means that the things that we used to do may not be available to us right now. And that can be discouraging. That can be its own form of trauma. But we do need to make sure and think about things that we can do that help us separate from the workday, even if it's just going outside and standing in the sunshine, or making sure that we're, engaging in media that doesn't have anything to do with work or COVID-19, reading books that are not related to the work that we do, that allow us to have an escape so that we're able to turn ourselves off from work and we're able to, just engage in things that aren't going to take us right back there automatically. This one's challenging. It's been challenging for me, but I can tell you that, by not engaging in outside of work self-care in a way that allowed me to have boundaries, contributed to a pretty bad case of burnout for me when I was working in program. And so this is important for me to share with all of you because I know that it's one of those little things that can make a huge difference. And it's often something that we talk ourselves out of because we love the work that we do. We get really passionate about it and we want to learn everything that we can and watch movies and listen to podcasts and do things that help us feel connected to it. But outside of work self-care, there should always be opportunities to disconnect from the work so that we can engage in it fully when it's time to, come back to that. Jessa, anything to add there with regard to self-care?
No, I mean, another big one is, again, not being afraid to establish boundaries around all three of these kind of buckets, especially now, whenever folks are trying to process their own experiences about the crisis, to make sure that you have that capacity first so that you're not, again, taking away from your own. And that could be considered an act of basic self-care, is establishing and protecting your boundaries. So again, just making sure that you have the capacity for what it is that's being asked of you to talk about or to watch or to look at, right? Same thing with your social media pages, to curate them to best fit the needs of your boundaries is, really important too.
Excellent point. So we wanted to share the self-care wheel because it's really easy to talk about self-care, but sometimes it's really challenging to think about what that even means. And so the self-care wheel is a really good way to kind of look at all of the different aspects of life that we may be able to engage in self-care. So there's psychological self-care, and that can include things like therapy, but that can also include things like journaling, sensory engagement. So once again, finding a hand sanitizer or a hand cream or something that smells really good, so that when you use it, it's like a 15-second break where we're just like, oh man, for me, I like things that smell like food. So, if there's a hand cream or something that smells like vanilla or cake or brownies, I love that because it gives me a little psychological boost and it helps me feel good. And self-care can be something that's just that simple. It doesn't have to be committing to therapy, once a week. It certainly can be. And if that's something that seems helpful for you, then that's a great way to take care of psychological self-care. But the nice thing about this wheel is that it gives us a lot of different options and a lot of different ways to engage in self-care, from the very big to the very minute, because we have to be in charge of what we have time for, so that self-care seems like something that we can engage in realistically. It shouldn't have to be something that requires a lot of time and space for us to feel like we can engage in it. It should be something that we can do and incorporate into our lives without a whole lot of disruption. So I think that the self-care wheel is really helpful because it gives us all of these suggestions. But the other thing to remember is that we don't have to do everything that's listed here. And what I encourage everybody to do is to pick one and to think about, when I'm feeling burned out, when I'm feeling that trauma activation occur, where does that tend to happen for me? And that's going to be a different answer, probably every day, maybe even every hour. But if we take the time to check in and say, man, today I'm really feeling like I just have this emotional need, then we can look for an emotional self-care thing that we can do that, that might be helpful. And that could be something as simple as having some affirmations on hand, knowing that, when I'm feeling down, when I'm feeling like I need a boost, it's really helpful to have some kind of an affirmation that I can say to myself that's going to help lift me out of that mood. And it'll only take me a couple of seconds to do. So one of the things that I think, is helpful also is to have a blank version of the self-care wheel, because, the one that you see that's already filled in has some really great suggestions, and maybe you can try some of those and see how they work for you. And if they work well, then you can put them into the self-care wheel and make your own list. But there's also going to be things that work for you and only you that aren't listed here. And so I think it's a really helpful tool to have, to start filling in your own self-care wheel so that you can start to see what works for you and engage with that in a way that's really personal. And having that self-care wheel to fill in is in and of itself a form of self-care, because it allows you to experiment and once again come back to that idea of who you are matters. Who you are matters, and that means that your self-care plan and your self-care wheel should be as subjective and unique to you as you can make it, because that way it's going to be like your little roadmap to engaging in meaningful self-care in a way that's going to work and help you feel good so that you want to continue doing it.
And then there's some times where you may have had an established self-care plan, or maybe haven't had a chance to really sit with yourself to actually create what your needs are. And sometimes the crisis happens first, right? Whenever you're faced with a crisis, it's less likely you're going to have time to create a healthy coping strategy, right? In the middle of a crisis, you're not going to say, oh no, I don't have a self-care plan. I'm going to ground myself and know exactly what I need. Right? Typically, that's not going to be the response, unfortunately. If it is your response, that's really great. That's a lot of self-awareness and self-control, which is amazing. So, unfortunately, that is, again, not going to be the typical response. So, just as the slide is saying, everything is awful and I'm not okay, right? I'm just ready to give up. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't, I don't feel like myself, and all of those other intrusive thoughts that can pop up. There's this resource, which I actually have laminated in my cubicle in the office, and something that I have saved on my desktop because I think it is very helpful. So this is called Everything is Awful and I'm Not Okay. This goes back to those immediate, to that basic self-care, but in the immediate, right? Things like, are you hydrated? Have you eaten recently? Have you showered recently? Have you stretched? Or, maybe it could be something like, again, do you feel unattractive, right? Take a selfie, right? Remind yourself of like, society sucks and you got this, right? Or have you cuddled something, any sort of sensory need that you may have? Have you waited if it's a bigger decision? It just covers, it's really nice things that you can kind of walk through kind of where you are and what your maybe immediate need is. Again, for you to get to a place where you can then be a little more grounded to then enact a self-care strategy that you've developed, or again, at least be able to see the situation and what you're feeling more clearly. But this is a really great resource, again, that really brings in that basic self-care that we oftentimes neglect or don't think of as self-care, these small acts of things. Again, even if you just wake up and it's really hard and it hurts to be awake, if you put on your favorite pair of socks for the day, right? It gives you a little bit of joy. It brings you some sort of grounding. You're changing into a new item of clothing, right? It boosts your self-esteem a little bit. It's these smaller actions that we can utilize that can add up to help with building up our self-care plan too.
Awesome. So to end this presentation, we wanted to go through some specific principles for working during COVID-19. And we recognize that, since this started in March, this has been a really big trauma. It's been a trauma for everyone. Everyone's experiencing this differently, but with regard to, doing domestic violence work, direct service, however you're engaged in this work, in this movement, COVID-19 has disrupted things in a lot of different ways. And so there's some principles that we want to leave everyone with today that we hope can help you navigate whatever you've been through and whatever's to come, and to help remember the importance of self-care and just managing this situation, which is so unique and so unusual, in the best ways possible. So we'd like to share those with you now. So the first thing to remember is that for those of you who are working from home, you're not working from home. You're actually at your home during a crisis trying to work. And it's really important to remember this no matter what stage of quarantine or restriction we're in, because COVID-19 has thrown us a lot of curveballs so far this year. Many of us, had to adapt our work situations in a huge way, whether that meant that we had to stay home and not work, whether that meant we had to work from home, whether we had to come into work during a very difficult situation. It's really important to remember that during COVID-19, this is not a normal situation. Whatever your work environment is, this is not a situation where normal, quote unquote, is to be expected. This is a crisis. And so it's really important to remember this, that you're working during a crisis, trying to work during a crisis, instead of putting the pressure on yourself to achieve and to do everything that you would have done, before the COVID-19 crisis happened.
The next principle or idea to think about is that your personal physical, mental, and emotional health is far more important than anything else right now. Right? Again, we are navigating our own personal experiences, right? On top of the work that we do, in the middle of a global pandemic, right? So everything has been literally turned upside down. What was the normal, right, is now no longer something that is a thing. This is now the new normal moving forward. There is no going back to things that existed in February, right? So it's important that, again, this goes back to understanding grieving and loss, because we're mourning for those things right now while trying to stay afloat. So it's important to recognize, again, your own activation, the way that you're feeling, to listen to your body. Again, if you need to get up and take a minute and leave because you're, working where you sleep, you're not really sure where you are anymore, and boundaries can get blurred very quickly. Again, being burnout emotionally is a very big thing. And again, we're experiencing an increase in isolation. As this progresses, it's getting longer and longer, because a lot of us thought, Memorial Day, we can do it till May, we got this. And now it's kind of now what? So we're in this period of no answer, so it can be extremely hard to navigate. So it's, again, important to recognize your own health, physical, mental, and emotional, are far more important than anything else right now. It's more important than work output, or making sure that you're meeting all these goals, or making sure that you're staying clocked in until the exact minute or hour on the minute, right? Because again, if you need to take care of yourself, that is what's most important right now.
And on that note, the next principle is that you shouldn't try to compensate for lost productivity by working longer hours right now. We've really tried to, highlight the fact that, once again, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And that means that taking care of yourself is the most important thing that you can do. At this point, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how things are going to be different moving forward. But as Jessa said, we're not going back to the way things were in February. And even this idea of lost productivity, in this time, I think it's really important to reframe, because once again, we are working during a crisis. And that means that everything that we used to know and everything that we used to do with regard to work and everything else is just different now. And so it's important to not think about this as, lost productivity that we then need to make up for by working through the night or working through the weekend. Instead, we need to focus on taking better care of ourselves, obviously prioritizing the things that need to be done, but also creating those boundaries that we talked about before and making sure that we're not getting stuck in this idea that we have to be exactly the same as we were before this crisis began. Prioritizing our own health and our own well-being is the best way to manage, so that no matter what happens moving forward, we have the ability to take care of ourselves, to take care of each other, and stop thinking about our work as, something that also needs to be, taking pieces of us. Right now, do the best that you can. And definitely, don't think about trying to compensate for any notion of lost productivity right now, because everything that we're able to put into our work and into survivors is incredibly productive and incredibly helpful. And our time after work, whatever that looks like, is for us to recharge, is for us to engage in our self-care, and to make sure that we're taking good care of ourselves.
So again, it's also important to be kind to yourself and not judge how you are coping based on how you see others coping. And this can be really hard, right? Where we see folks that, especially early on in quarantine, where folks were like, oh, I love this family time. I love being home. This is so amazing. Or now we're seeing people that are anti-maskers, right, that are going out in large groups. That can be really anxiety inducing, and make you question, like, should I really be at home? Am I doing the right thing? Am I isolating myself, right? It's important to not allow those types of things to creep into what you're doing that's best for you, and to be kind to yourself. Again, we see a lot of there were a lot of memes. There still are things going around the internet about like gaining the quarantine 15, being more, hyper vigilant about what kind of calories you're consuming, what foods you're consuming during quarantine. And, if that's, one of your coping mechanisms or a way that you're finding comfort is to, to eat or, indulge in things that make you feel good, but are now seeing things about weight gain that can be extremely triggering or activating, specifically for folks that have body image issues or have struggled with or are struggling with eating disorders, things like that. It can really impact the way that you're coping and how you're judging yourself and how you're showing up for yourself. So it's really important, again, to listen to what your needs are and not to compare yourself to others.
On that note, it's really important to also be kind to others and not judge how they're coping based on how you are coping. And so it's sort of a two-way street there, because we do see other people that are doing things that, we may not agree with, we may not like the way, that they're handling the situation, but we need to try and remember to understand that everybody, once again, is seeing this situation, through their own lens of trauma. And what works for other people may seem really, bananas to us. But it's part of our self-care to not get wrapped up in that. Because right now, the best thing that we can do is be kind to ourselves and be kind to each other. Everybody has different coping strategies. Everybody has different ways that, that they manage a crisis. And I think that, this COVID-19 situation has been a real life demonstration of that. This is something that we see with the survivors that we work with every day, but now we're watching everybody deal with a trauma, and we're seeing everybody deal with that vastly differently from each other. And that can really bring us apart. We can start to become judgmental of each other, of ourselves, and that really doesn't do anything to help us cope with the situation in a healthy way. And so, those people that are posting on Facebook about, or the COVID-15, or oh, I learned Portuguese while I was, working from home. Like, we can have a lot of feelings about that, but it's important to be kind and understand that, some people are going to cope in that way. And if that's what works for them, that's great. And if posting about it on social media works for them, super. But that doesn't have anything to do with what works for us. and how we're coping and what we need to do to get through a crisis situation. And so being kind extends to other people as well.
And then, of course, your team success will not be judged the same way it was when things were normal, right? Again, normal in quotations, because what actually is normal. But again, this goes into that, the world that existed, that we were working and functioning in, living in, building our lives in, is no longer the same. It will never go back to that, right? It's not just gonna, a vaccine will come or whatever may happen where COVID is, solved, is conquered, and now we're back and we pick up our lives from where it was, at the end of February, beginning of March, before the quarantine happened. That's not true. The world is going to look different, moving forward, right? Especially in terms of work. We're seeing a lot more remote opportunities, whereas before that may not have been something that was happening. The way that we're providing services will now be different. And again, those things aren't necessarily just going to go away. So again, it's very important that we take time for ourselves and take care of ourselves as we're navigating this new normal, because we aren't going to know what that looks like for a very long time. What it's like now also may not be what it's like come the end of the year, because things look different now than they did in April, right? It's a literally day-to-day type of adaptability that we're all working through. So again, it's important not to push yourself or punish yourself for this idea of, quote unquote, lost productivity by, burning yourself out, by taking on more, for working longer hours, those types of things. It doesn't mean that you're a failure at work. Especially in our field, we have this tendency of advocacy to overwork ourselves, that we get a gold star for putting in an extra time, or we don't think folks that don't do that aren't putting in that extra time or working themselves to that point, don't take the movement or the work as seriously. And this is the perfect time to start undoing that myth. It's extremely important for us to take care of our own individual selves, in our collective teams, our workplaces. And again, it doesn't mean you're not successful. It doesn't mean you're not taking things seriously. It doesn't mean you're not working just as hard, if not more so, right? But it's important to establish, again, boundaries to protect your physical, mental, and emotional health. Boundaries around what your workday looks like, what your spaces look like, your environments, what the difference is between being at home and being at work when you're in those same spaces. Or again, like if you are going into the office spaces or going into shelter, what that looks like, on how to build boundaries around that while maintaining your safety, right? Because that's important. So it's really, again, it's critical that we kind of reframe the way that we approach what success actually means, because again, it can't be held to the same standard as it was pre-COVID. So Michelle,
Right.
I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
I just think it's really crucial for everyone to think about the best ways that they can take care of themselves and each other. We hear so much from all of you about, the situation just really being a challenge, and all of the ways that it just continues to wear us down. We think that we've got everything figured out, that we know how to manage this, and then something else happens and we feel like the rug's been pulled out from under us again. And so it's just really important for me and for Jessa. We wanted to create this resource as a way to, remind all of you about the importance of the work that you do and the contributions that you make every single day to this work, that you're valuable, and that this situation is an unusual situation that is absolutely a trauma and a crisis that we're all figuring out how to work through together. And so, we hope that these resources are helpful for you, that taking the time to think about self-care is helpful for you. And we also want to make sure, that you feel comfortable reaching out to us and to PCADD if you need some extra help, or if you want to talk more about any of the things that we've talked about in this training, whether it's secondary trauma, whether it's coping strategies and self-care. There's resources that we have, there's resources that we can share, that we can create. We're here to help you through this exceptional situation because we know that you're exceptional individuals and we want to be able to help you manage this crisis any way that we possibly can because you're so valuable in the work that you do and in the things that you're able to provide for survivors, even during a situation like COVID-19. And we appreciate that.
Well, thank you everyone for watching our presentation. Again, if you have any questions or want to follow up about resources, here's our contact information. Please don't hesitate to do so. That is why we're here. We're here to support you along the way with whatever you may need.